We live in a world where we get constantly bombarded with perspectives, teachings and points of view. What to believe, who to listen to. Here, I will provide some alternative perspectives. Here, you are encouraged to check for yourself, form your own informed opinions and make up your own mind. From the spiritual to the mundane, join me as I dive into some of the biggest and smallest issues facing us all. Hello and welcome to the podcast of Laird John.
I mean, it is just a weird, crazy world we live in at the moment. And who is it that's to decide how to resolve all the weirdness that's going on at the moment? Whether it's war, whether it's political or religious polarity, anything and everything in between, all the things that cause one or the other, the people, the situations, the organisations, the governments, the churches, the religions. There's none of us little people that can really affect it, is there? There's not something that we can do singularly or even potentially collectively anytime soon, or at least that's how it feels, that could actually bring an end to the trouble and the strife and the suffering that's going on in the world right now. It's like there's no end to it. There's one thing after the other. What's going to happen next? You know, first there's one thing, then there's another thing, then there's another thing. And there always seems to be something to distract us. Always seems to be something to just keep us preoccupied and scared. Not knowing what to do. Not thinking that we can do anything about it anyway. Feeling completely helpless. And then we just conform to whatever we get told to do. But is that the way it's really supposed to be? And if it isn't, then what do we do about it? That comes back to the thing that I said at the beginning. We all feel quite powerless. How can you do something if you're, after all, one single little guy or girl, some corner of the, let's say, Western world? That's where I am, in a corner of the Western world, up in the north of Scotland right now. You know, what can I do, or what can you do, wherever you are, to solve the problems of the world? It's a big ask, isn't it? And in the meantime, whatever individuals or people or organisations are getting on with, whatever it is that they want to get on with, here we are just, dumb victims, are we, of it all? But we're not in the Western world, apparently. We're really privileged here. Because we are not in one of the corners of the world where all the mayhem and murders and war and strife is going on right now. We're not in one of those corners of the world where people can't live safe in a home for being bombed. We're not in one of those corners of the world which is, completely lawless to the point where there just is no law and order. Or at least I'm not here in the north of Scotland. That there might be some people in the Western world who feel that the particular corner of the Western world where they live isn't so safe. There's certainly certain parts of the United States that isn't so safe from what I read, although I have not been there to find out for myself. You guys would have to let me know. But there are corners of the world that aren't safe for the people who live in them. Not safe for themselves, not safe for the adults, and not safe for the children. They're not safe for anyone. They're certainly not safe for the people who perpetrate all the violence. Because in perpetrating violence, they run the risk of being victims of it. There is that old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And I suppose we could sit comfortably in the Western world, whatever corner of it we're in our alleged privileged status, and say, well, it's all right for us then. But is it all right for us? Is it really? I mean, I grew up, I suppose, in the 80s, you could say. I'm a 60s child. Grew up as a young child in the 70s and into my teens, into my mid-teens in the 80s, early 80s. getting drunk in the 80s, of course, and all that kind of thing, and living through what was at the time the first Cold War, yes. And I can remember, actually my I've been told by family members who are old enough to know and who were in the forces at the time, either here or in the United States, that for them the Cold War was anything but cold. But the rest of us thought of it as a Cold War. And there was that old thing of, what would you do if you got a 3-minute warning? And I used to say, boil an egg. Because what would you do if you got a 3-minute warning that said a bomb was on its way and it was going to obliterate you? It was a nuclear bomb, you had no chance of survival. And so the whole Western world for the period of the First Cold War literally lived in fear for all that time. Now, they didn't go about their lives literally shaking with fear all the time. They just got on with their lives and got used to the idea that there was a chance of something, but they just lived in denial of the chance being a realistic chance, presumably because that's the only way that they could get on with it and not feel fear all the time. I suppose you could say perhaps it's similar to the way that people who suffer from trauma, and I've been one of those, unfortunately. People who suffer from real trauma often block out some of the memories of the source of the trauma as a way of dealing with it and getting on with their lives. And I think the whole Western world kind of just lived in denial of the real danger during the 80s, that there could be a nuclear catastrophe. And of course, I'm saying 80s because that was the decade I grew up in, but the Cold War started long before that. Not long after the end of the Second World War, I think. I didn't think about it. I had other things to worry about as a child. But as I began to grow up as a teenager in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, what did come to me, or what came across to me, about the news that was on the TV constantly about the strife between the Soviet Union and America and Britain and the rest of the Western world and things like that, and the risks, and the back and forth, the constant back and forth, the threats and counter threats being voiced over the mainstream news channels by both sides, flexing muscles and what have you, having arms races, who can build the biggest bomb, who can build the biggest warship, who can tease each other more with their warships, tempting each other to, by slipping into each other's waters and things like that. And it was a very dangerous time, and I think most of us were just in denial that it could actually happen. But we live in the Western world where it's really safe and we've got lots of laws and regulations. The establishment we have, we can really trust them. They'll find a way to negotiate out of it. It'll be fine. It was just recently that I came across a story that, and I don't know how true it is, so this is purely secondhand information, something I read on the internet. So I believe that if I go back and check it, I'm just thinking about it just now, and I might check it later, but you guys can check if you want. There was a story that apparently there was a false alarm that nearly caused nuclear war, and it was because a Russian outpost, or a Soviet outpost, I don't know whether it was specifically Russian, received a signal stating, or saying essentially that the Americans had launched a nuclear war against Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, and the bombs were literally on their way. Now, this clever Soviet chap who was, had the responsibility for potentially receiving the information about the signal and triggering a response to it, which would mean nuclear, Armageddon for all of us, chose to not believe that signal, and he didn't press the red button. And because of that, because it turned out that the signal saying that they were being attacked by the Americans was a false signal, and they weren't being attacked. that literally saved the world, because that was moments away from nuclear catastrophe for all of us. So here we were, sitting comfortably in our living room or wherever we were in the Western world, feeling privileged and all the rest of it, apparently. And we were inches away from nuclear Armageddon and didn't know it. We were cracking jokes about, well, cracking an egg if we got the 3-minute warning. But that actually really, really nearly happened. And it was a Soviet chap that saved us all by not responding because he suspected correctly that it was a false signal. And he didn't respond to it, and the world was saved. But because he didn't obey the protocol, as far as I understand it, he was actually disciplined afterwards. So the guy is like the biggest hero this planet has ever seen. But the Soviets actually disciplined him because he didn't obey the protocols. Now, can you believe that? I do. So we're all privileged in the Western world, but we've spent decades upon decades, living in fear, with a kind of underlying trauma, if you like, worried about the potential of some kind of Armageddon. It's not surprising that there are so many conspiracy theories going around when you think about it as well, because we've got that mindset. We're always waiting for the next disaster. And there always seems to be some kind of disaster on the horizon anyway, courtesy of whatever the powers that be want to deliver upon us from one moment to the next. Because let's face it, even if you don't believe in conspiracy theories, you've got to believe that it was effectively powers that be that created and caused and maintained the Cold War for so long and kept us all in fear. From both sides. There's no point pointing our fingers at the Soviets and said it's all their fault, they were the baddies. We in the West, don't have our hands completely clean either when it comes to this. And it's quite possible that the powers that be that cause all this have got their own agendas in any event, to which we are all just pawns. I couldn't possibly accuse anyone of anything not having any evidence, but it just strikes me that the military-industrial complex would have made an awful lot of money out of that. And the pharmaceutical industry would have made an awful lot of money out of the medical industry during that time as well. And there's an awful lot of money to be made in business, stemming from catastrophes. And again, that also feeds into conspiracy theories. So we've got a Western world living in a state of paranoia. Now we've got a resurgence of things like flat Earth theories and things like that. People believing that we're really ruled by reptilians from Alpha Draconis, and the elites are just pawns of them. And there's all sorts of other craziness going on that people are willing to believe, because they'll believe almost anything, in the state of fear that they're in. I think if I was to put a handle on the one problem that we need to cure in the world that's the most dangerous to us all, that one would be that feeling of perpetual fear. Unfortunately, for us to cure ourselves of that, we would have to cure ourselves of the I suppose you could say, of the kind of political and media and other establishments that we have in the Western world at the moment that have got most influence over everything that's going on. Because they're the ones ultimately that are keeping us in that state, aren't they? If you choose to, listen to it and watch it and believe it, they're the ones that are keeping us in that state. Because every other year there's another catastrophe. The 20th and 21st century so far has been like one long movie of disaster after disaster after disaster after disaster. I can say all this to you knowing full well that I don't have to provide any evidence of it, because you already know what I'm talking about. You could tell me half of this, or all of it, or more than I know. All you have to do, is think about some of the stuff that's happened over the last 70 years. Since the end of, think of some of the things that have happened since the end of the Second World War. The Cold War. 9/11 in the US. Other murder and mayhem catastrophes in the UK and around the Western world. All sorts of wars around the globe that the Western world have been involved in, one way or another. All sorts of false flags and accusations of conspiracies and all the rest of it, because of the natural feeling of paranoia in the population. And all sorts of real conspiracies, those that have actually over time turned out to be true. Operation Paperclip. People in, the Nazi scientists from Germany ending up working for the US and NASA and other places. Mockingbird, US influence in media. Similar operations in the UK, or different operations in the UK, but with a similar aim, should I say, with control of the media. And other things. There's been so many, unfortunately, there's been so many things that have actually come true, turned out to be true 20 or 30 years later, that we thought that we would have laughed at the time. Oh, don't be so daft, it's a conspiracy theory. So we're wondering I'm wondering of the things that have been happening over the last few years. Are we going to be looking back and laughing at them in 20 years and say, see that craziness, that was all a conspiracy? Right now, that there's a lot of people believe right now that a lot of the things that have been happening in the last few years have been a conspiracy. There's a lot of people that don't. And those who don't are pointing at the whole paranoia argument. You see, if you weren't so paranoid, you wouldn't believe everything stupid, you dafty. But there'll be even if it only comes down to that old Churchillian maxim, never let a political crisis go to waste, there's certainly been a lot of conspiracy over the last few years. Just how far it goes is the only question, not whether or not there was some. So the fear continues. Fear over medical conditions, fear over medical interventions, fear over survival of democracy, fear over wars in Europe, fear over religious tensions, fear over racial tensions, fear over wars in the Middle East, fear over fear. Where does it end? This is why I'm saying fear is the biggest enemy. But here's the thing, the only person who can really cure the fear in you is you. The only person who can calm the paranoia in you is you. So, I lived through that, and a lot of people did. Anyone my age who's still alive, and a lot of people, anyone who's older who's still alive, even a few who are a little younger, will have lived through at least part of the Cold War. And they'll know a lot. They'll know about what I'm talking about. They'll understand what I'm saying. They might not agree entirely with everything I'm saying, but they will understand where I'm coming from. A lot of people who are a lot younger than that, the newer generation who didn't live through that, won't understand that. But they're living through a new era of fear. They're just living through a different type of fear. And this is the biggest enemy we have. The enemy we have right now in this world is not each other. The only enemy we have is fear.
I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. If you did, please share far and wide so others can benefit too. and download the podcast audio so you can listen again whenever you like, wherever you like. You can also view and comment on podcast episodes by visiting johnsoracle.com. Thanks for listening to the podcast of Lord John. I've been your host, John McVey.